The dust-choked air of a forward operating base in Iraq's Anbar province carried the usual tension, the kind that settled into the bones of every operator conducting a key leader engagement in a volatile village. The sun was a hammer, pounding down on the concrete and HESCO barriers as a joint team of Navy SEALs and Army support personnel pushed through the crowded market. The SEALs moved with practiced aggression, eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways, their rifles an extension of their bodies. And among them, a senior chief petty officer, a man with the craggy face of someone who had seen too much and the calm demeanor of an apex predator, led the patrol. To him, the mission was straightforward: make contact with the local sheik, gather intelligence, and show a presence. What he didn't expect was to have his entire perception of combat flipped on its head by a woman who, until that moment, he had dismissed as just another interpreter or civil affairs specialist tagging along at the rear. The patrol had stopped at a designated rally point near a crumbling wall. The senior chief, let's call him Mike, crouched down, pulling out his map to coordinate with the platoon commander. A shot cracked the air. Not the ragged pop of an AK-47, but the distinct, authoritative thump of a U.S. military sniper rifle. It was close. Instinctively, everyone flattened against the wall, weapons up. "Contact! Sniper!" Mike yelled into his radio, trying to pinpoint the origin of the shot. A second later, another round split the air. Then silence. Mike scanned the rooftops they controlled. He spotted a puff of dust settling near a chimney 2 buildings over, their own overwatch position. "What the hell are they shooting at?" he muttered to the lieutenant. "We didn't authorize suppressing fire. Did they see an IED team?" The lieutenant checked his net. "Negative. No call sign reporting engagement." Frustrated, Mike grabbed a young petty officer. "Get on the horn with that rooftop. I ask them who the hell is the sniper and what are they shooting at. They're going to compromise the whole op." The petty officer tried the tactical frequency but got only static. The rooftop team was either ignoring comms or too focused to respond. Just as Mike was about to storm over there himself, the shooter appeared. It wasn't one of the SEALs he'd posted. It wasn't even a man. A figure in oversized body armor and a helmet that seemed too big for their frame jogged down the alley toward them, carrying a modified M110 semi-automatic sniper system. As the figure got closer, Mike realized it was a woman. Her face was smeared with camouflage paint, and her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had just done something irreversible. She stopped in front of Mike and the lieutenant, breathing heavily. "Sir, we had 2 insurgents attempting to flank the patrol from the irrigation ditch to the east. They were setting up a PKM machine gun. I neutralized both threats." Her voice was calm, professional, cutting through the heat like a knife. Mike was stunned. He hadn't authorized any snipers in that sector. "Who gave you the authority to engage? You're not even supposed to be on the trigger. What unit are you with?" His voice was a mix of anger and confusion. The woman reached up, unzipping the top of her dusty uniform blouse to reveal the rank insignia pinned to her collar beneath, an insignia that made Mike's blood run cold. It wasn't the single chevron of a junior enlisted soldier or the bar of a junior officer. It was the silver oak leaf of a Navy commander, or in Army terms, a lieutenant colonel. She outranked every single person on that patrol, including Mike. "Commander Sarah Jensen, Naval Intelligence Support Element," she said flatly. And with all due respect, "Me senior chief, I've been doing this since before your first deployment. I saw the threat, I had the angle, and I took the shot. We can discuss protocol back at the FOB, but right now, those 2 aren't going to be shooting at anyone ever again." The silence that followed was deafening. Mike stared at the woman, this commander who looked more like a supply officer than a sniper, and realized he was witnessing something that defied every convention of the modern battlefield. Here was a high-ranking intelligence officer, someone who should be behind a desk analyzing satellite photos, pulling double duty as a covert sniper. The revelation didn't just challenge his assumptions about rank, It shattered his understanding of how the war was actually being fought. To understand how Commander Sarah Jensen ended up in that dusty alley with powder burns on her fingers and a smoking rifle, you have to go back 2 decades. Sarah grew up in rural Montana, the daughter of a hunting guide and a school teacher. By the age of 12, she could strip down a bolt-action rifle and reassemble it blindfolded. She could read wind patterns across a valley and calculate bullet drop with an intuition that seemed almost mystical. But she was also a straight-A student, valedictorian of her class, and desperate to escape the limited horizons of her small town. And she turned down a full ride to an Ivy League university to accept an appointment to the United States Naval Academy. At Annapolis, she was a standout, not just academically, but in the crucible of leadership. She was recruited for her linguistic genius, picking up Arabic and Pashto with terrifying speed. Her superiors saw her as a future intelligence guru, a woman who could sit across from a tribal elder and read him like a children's book. They pushed her toward the intelligence community, away from the grunt work of infantry. But Sarah never let go of her rifle. While her peers in the Intelligence Directorate spent their days writing briefs and analyzing drone footage, Sarah spent her weekends and personal training time at the sniper ranges. She begged, borrowed, and bartered for range time with the Marine Corps Scout Snipers and the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. They humored her at first, a lieutenant commander playing soldier, until they saw her shoot. She could consistently hit targets at 1,000 meters with a standard M24. She could estimate range and wind better than most of their junior shooters. They started inviting her back. By the time she pinned on Commander, Sarah had a reputation that was whispered in the dark corners of the Special Operations community. She was the Ghost, an intelligence officer who could talk her way onto high-risk missions because she provided actionable intel in real time, often from a hide site 2 clicks away from the objective. She had a kill count that rivaled many seasoned SEALs, but officially, those kills didn't exist. Her records were scrubbed, buried under layers of classification. The mission that day was supposed to be routine. The target was a mid-level facilitator suspected of moving Iranian-made EFP components into the city. Sarah had inserted with the patrol not as a shooter, but as an observer. She was there to identify faces, to listen to the chatter in the market, to build the intelligence picture. She carried a rifle because, in her words, carrying a rifle is cheaper than paying a bodyguard. No one questioned it. They assumed she was just another intel puke playing dress-up. But when the patrol halted, Sarah's instincts kicked in. She had scouted the route the night before on satellite imagery and noticed the irrigation ditch, a natural avenue of approach for a flanking maneuver. While the SEALs focused on the buildings and the crowd, Sarah's eyes kept drifting to that ditch. She saw a flicker of movement, then another. 2 men, carrying what looked like a heavy weapons component. She didn't radio it in. There wasn't time. The patrol was static. The men in the ditch were moving fast. In the 3 seconds it took for her brain to process the threat, she had already made the decision. She slipped away from the group. She climbed to the rooftop via a pre-planned route she'd noted earlier and settled into position. She watched the men through her scope. They set up the bipod of the PKM. One of them racked the charging handle. She fired. The first round took the gunner in the chest. The second round took the assistant as he tried to grab the weapon and run. 2 shots, 2 kills, less than 4 seconds apart. Textbook. She scanned for additional threats, saw none, and then made her way down to face the music. Back in the alley, Mike was struggling to process the situation. A commander, a full bird commander, had just exposed herself to enemy fire and killed 2 men. The implications were staggering. If she had been captured, the propaganda value would have been immense. If she had been killed, the investigation would have been a nightmare. But standing there, looking at her calm, sweat-streaked face, Mike realized that none of that mattered to her. She had seen a threat to her people, and she had eliminated it. Rank, protocol, personal safety, it was all secondary. "Commander," Mike finally managed, his voice losing its edge. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. We need to clear the area and extract, now." Sarah nodded. "Agreed. Let's move. I'll take rear security." She didn't ask for permission. She simply fell into the patrol formation, her rifle up, her eyes scanning the rooftops behind them. The SEALs looked at her differently now. They didn't see a staff officer, and they saw a shooter, a warrior. The extraction was uneventful. Back at the FOB, the debriefing was tense. Mike had to write a report. Sarah had to write a report. The commanding officer of the Joint Task Force, a one-star general, had to be briefed. There was talk of reprimands, of restricting Sarah's movements, of sending her back to the green zone where she belonged. But the general, a former Delta Force operator himself, read the reports. I looked at the imagery of the 2 dead insurgents with the PKM set up and ready to fire, and made a decision. He called Sarah into his office. "Commander, you broke about a dozen regulations today. You left your assigned position without authorization. You engaged enemy combatants without a direct order. You exposed a high-value intelligence asset to extreme risk." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he leaned forward. "You also saved the lives of every man on that patrol. Acted within the bounds of protecting acted within the bounds of protecting U.S. forces, and file it away. You are never to speak of this to anyone outside this room. Am I clear?" Sarah saluted. "Clear, sir." But the story didn't stay buried. It couldn't. The SEALs on that patrol talked. They talked to their buddies, and their buddies talked to journalists. The legend of the female sniper commander spread through the special operations community like wildfire. Some didn't believe it. Others claimed she was a myth, a story told to scare new guys. But those who were there knew the truth. Years later, after Sarah retired from active duty with a chest full of medals she could never fully explain, she was approached by a historian writing a book on women in combat. The historian had heard whispers. He had tracked down redacted documents, had pieced together enough of the puzzle to ask the right questions. Sarah initially refused to comment. But the historian was persistent, and eventually Sarah agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop in Virginia, far from the military installations where she was still known. Over cold brew coffee, the historian asked about the incident. Sarah was quiet for a long time. "You have to understand," she finally said, "it wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about being a woman in a man's world. It was about the 2 men in that ditch. They were going to kill my friends. I had a rifle. I had the skill. Everything else, the rank, the rules, the politics, was just noise." The historian asked if she regretted it. Sarah laughed, a short, mirthless sound. "Regret? I regret that I didn't see them sooner. I regret that there are still American kids over there getting shot at by people who hide in ditches and shoot from crowds. I don't regret pulling the trigger. Not for 1 second." When asked about the moment Mike confronted her, Sarah smiled slightly. The look on his face was priceless. He was so sure he had everything under control. He had the rank, the experience, the swagger. And then some girl shows up and tells him she just saved his ass. It was a wake-up call for him. For a lot of them. She sipped her coffee. War doesn't care about your rank. It doesn't care about your gender. It only cares about who shoots first and shoots straight. That day, I shot first. The story of Commander Sarah Jensen remains largely unknown to the public. There are no movies about her, no books with her name on the cover. The official records are sealed, and those who know the truth are bound by oaths and a culture of secrecy. But in the mess halls of special operations bases, in the whispered conversations between veterans at reunions, her story lives on. It serves as a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear the expected face. Sometimes it wears the face of a mother, a scholar, an intelligence officer who happens to be the deadliest shot on the battlefield. Mike, the senior chief who confronted her, eventually left the Navy. He struggled with the memories of his deployments, the faces of the men he lost. But whenever the darkness closed in, he thought about that day in the alley. He thought about Sarah Jensen, the commander who materialized out of the dust to save them. She became a symbol for him, not of a broken system, but of the unpredictable, fiercely protective nature of the human spirit. He reached out to her years later, after she retired. They met for dinner. He thanked her. She nodded, shook his hand, and disappeared back into her quiet life. In the end, the question, "Who's the sniper?" was answered not with a name or a rank, but with a truth as old as warfare itself. On the battlefield, the only thing that matters is the person willing to pull the trigger when it counts. And sometimes, that person is a woman whose actual military rank is the least interesting thing about her.